This is a therapeutics production project, Dark Thoughts, Chapter 3, Philosophy and Religion, the third installment in a series following a forgotten black philosopher who challenged the wicked practices of slavery. In this chapter, we explore how Ottobah Cugano's best shield was in fact a sword. He used his words to cut through the propaganda of the slave trade, exposing it as godless rhetoric. The sword Ottobah so proudly wielded was his unwavering devotion to Christianity. Having been baptized at 16, yet he did not strike so recklessly. Instead, he employed philosophy and motivational language to persuade the British public to see the truth as he did. Let's turn back the pages to a time when religious thinking dominated the political landscape.
But this will appear evident to all men that believed in the scriptures, that every reason necessary is given that they should be believed, and in the case that they offered us the information that all mankind did spring from the original, that there are no different species among men. God who made the world have made of one blood all the nations of men that dwell on the face of the earth. Wherefore we may justify infer, as there are no inferior species, but all of one blood and of one nature.
The book itself is Jeremiah because he positions himself very much like the Old Testament Jeremiah, who issues a warning to his people, in this case to the people of Great Britain, that if they don't change their ways, they're going to be cursed and doomed. And in fact, he quotes Jeremiah. It's the last quotation in his book, and his book is full of quotations from the Old and New Testament, because he's like an Old Testament voice. He's issuing this, it's essentially a long sermon, you might say. This is one of the reasons why there's a lot of repetition in the book, that if we try to read it, it's not like it's not like a novel. But he includes a lot of different things in it. There's a history in it, the history of slavery he includes in it. It's an economic treatise. He talks about that the British should start to trade with Africa, not in Africans. They should replace the trade in Africans with the trade with Africa for commodities other than human commodities. And so no one had done this before.
So throughout history, many minorities, let's say, have been ignored or neglected a little bit, like non-Western philosophy, but also feminist philosophy and female philosophers. And so that was the case during the Enlightenment period as well, I think. Although it is important to know that it was black thinkers like Cugano and Cugano who emphasized that, in the West, the focus was on liberty and freedom, while at the same time there was slavery happening in the rest of the world, basically. And they pointed out those contradictions and those inconsistencies by recounting their own stories and reflecting on human rights and the rights of enslaved people as well.
Well, in his own person and his own writings, he demonstrates the potential of people of African descent, that anyone like James Tobin that I mentioned earlier, or David Hume, who doubt the potential of people of African descent. Here he is right in their face, saying, okay, look what I can do. I'm steeped in the Bible. He doesn't simply repeat the Bible, he adopts the Bible, he conflates Old Testament and New Testament verses in his epigraph that begins his book. And he adopts a biblical voice. At various points, he addresses his readers as "O ye," as if he's speaking from the Old Testament or even the New Testament to them. He's demonstrating how much he has learned.
But the prediction and curse rested wholly upon the offsprings of Canaan, who settled in the land known by his name, in the West Asia. As in evident from the sacred writings, the Canaanites became an exceeding wicked people and were visited with many calamities, according to the predictions of Noah, for their abominable wickedness and idolatry. Now the descendants of the other three sons of Ham were not included under the curse of his father. And as they dispersed and settled on the different parts of the earth, they became also sundry distinct and very formidable nations. Cush the oldest settled in the southwest of Arabia, and his descendants were anciently known to the Hebrews by his name of Cushites. One of his sons, Nimrod, founded the kingdom of Babylon in Asia, and the others made their descent southward by the Red Sea, and came over to Abyssinia and Ethiopia, and likely dispersed themselves throughout all the southern and interior parts of Africa. And as they lived mostly under the torrid zone or near the tropics, they became black as being natural to the inhabitants of those sultry hot climates. And in that case, their complexion bears the significance of the name of their original progenitor.
They stood as examples of radical, intelligent black men, which really kind of pushed against the stereotype that a lot of people at the time had of African and black people in general, which was that they weren't capable of this sort of intellectual curiosity and thinking, especially in the case of Cugano. His work goes far beyond just the issues of slavery. He deals with human rights, he deals with the question of imperialism, and in many senses he's actually writing about issues that some white European thinkers, intellectuals are not talking about at the time, and stuff that's only kind of revisited. The history of imperialism, something within Britain that's only really revisited in earnest after the British Empire collapses post Second World War, right? But 150 years later, then Cugano is actually writing about this issue.
Just undertone. In fact, he ends with kind of catechism of he shifts from addressing fellow Africans, to addressing fellow Britons, because he has this dual identity, which he takes advantage of, because he positions himself as a kind of stranger in a strange land, which again goes back to the biblical context, in which he can observe the British from the outside. He's like an inside outsider, outside insider. So he switches his positions as he thinks is appropriate, because he's very rhetorically aware of what he's trying to do. And so he issues this great warning to his fellow Britons, I can't say fellow citizens because he wasn't a citizen, but that if they do not straighten up, they're going to be doomed. They have it. He's writing when he's hopeful. There are glimmers of hope, because the American Revolution has ended, not well for the Brits, but it opened a time for a national kind of self-examination. How could Britain, the most powerful country in the world at that time, have been defeated by these American colonists? This means that, to him, that God must be punishing the British. They must have to do something as a community to redeem themselves. And the easiest way to do this, the obvious way to do this, is to deal with slavery. Because at this point in history, the British are carrying more than, or approximately half of the 80,000 enslaved Africans a year who are being brought from Africa to the Americas.
We are very much part of a global community now. Travel, not only our young people going abroad, but young people and other people coming to us. And in order for us to understand culture, we need to understand history. We need to know where we're coming from, where people are coming from, and what makes humanity. Because I think at the moment we're missing a little bit on the humanity side. And I think that comes from a lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation, a lack of empathy for what other people experience.
It's very typical for those writers like Cugano and Equiano to use those Western concepts of rights and freedoms and what they've read in the Western world and what they've seen in the UK when Cugano was in England, for example, and to apply that to the African context. But I do find it very important that he emphasizes that human rights are universal values, individual freedoms are universal values. The equality of people should be extended to include people of color as well. Now we take that more or less for granted in the intellectual world at least, but back then that was quite controversial.
Contrast Old Testament slavery with contemporaneous slavery. In the Old Testament slavery, of course, it wasn't hereditary. In the contemporaneous slavery, it's hereditary. It's race-based or complexion-based, they would say.
Even though they may have many different views and bad practices amongst them, the continent of Africa is of vast extent, and the numerous inhabitants are divided into several kingdoms and principalities, which are governed by one's prospective kings and princes, and those are absolutely maintained by their free subjects. Very few nations make slaves of any of those under their government.
Slavery has existed since Roman times, even ancient Egyptian times. Slavery existed in West Africa and West Central Africa in some way as well. It was never the same as what chattel slavery became, and I'll talk about what I mean when I say chattel slavery. The justification given to the need or the reason why African people were enslaved very much comes down to kind of religious justification here. Now, European thinkers and intellectuals and religious figures really had to scramble here to find biblical justifications for slavery. And they did so through several Old Testament, several stories in the Old Testament. Principally, the one is of the punishment of Ham, in which Ham is cast out as a sinner. And there is some sort of association there, at least, even though it's not mentioned in the text, that his skin was dark. And so, based on that one little fact, that became one of the principal justifications for racialized slavery of enslavement of African and darker-skinned people. There was, of course, a scientific kind of justification for it later on, that African and non-white people were less intelligent, less evolved than white people. Of course, we know that is absolute garbage.
Well, race in the 18th century is much more complex than it is in the 19th century that we're more familiar with. Because in the 18th century, most people at least had to give lip service to the biblical basis for the origin of mankind, which is monogenesis. That's the nice big word for it. The notion that all of us descended from Adam and Eve. One monogenesis, one beginning. It's only in the 19th century that you really have developed the polygenesis, this notion that different humans descended from different origins, which enables the argument for that there's supposedly an inferior group of humans. This is pseudoscientific racism that really comes up in the 19th century. It's very hard to argue that in the 18th century. So cugano really plays hard into that notion that we're all commonly descended from Adam and Eve. And the only difference between us is complexion, essentially the only difference between us, and religion, that Africans hadn't been exposed to Christianity. The notion that people of African descent could not be educated, he's trying to disprove by the very fact that he's publishing the book. He writes about having gotten some education once he was enslaved. He sees Christianity as what you might call a fortunate fall. This seems paradoxical. It is paradoxical, I guess.
I think it's more interesting to see that he uses Western concepts against the West. So there was a lot of hypocrisy basically in Europe back then. The focus was on enlightenment and reasoning, rationality, and on liberty and freedom, but only applied to white people. And that's just hypocritical. All men are equal, especially if they're white, right? And if you're black or of color, then you're not as equal as white people. Yeah. And so it's, I think, the achievement of Equiano and Cugano and other writers to point out that hypocrisy and to say, look, if you think that all men are equal, then that will include black people as well. And I'm now saying men because that was the parlance of those days. Now, of course, it's people, right? It's not only men.
They're setting a tradition, both literary tradition of writing about slavery, and because it's really important. I mean, it's really important because these books become, especially the case of Equiano, less so with Cugano, but Equiano, these books are reprinted across both sides of the Atlantic. Equiano's narrative is reprinted in the United States. It's something that's read by both black and white activists and anyone, black and white people, anyone who's literate. So they set off kind of a trend of mass storytelling from a kind of an African perspective.
Whether scientific or religious, the belief that some human beings are inherently superior has lingered throughout history, often sealed tightly within its own perspective. Ottobah, however, stood between two worlds, as a black man from Africa who was once enslaved and as a British philosophical thinker who was a devout Christian. He would go on to draw from both identities, construct his arguments with clarity and depth.
Where we might call him cautious is the way he talks to the British, because he sees them as a greater hope than, say, the French, of course, who were terrible to the British in the 18th century. They had helped the American revolutionaries defeat the British in the recent war. So obviously they're bad, but they're not as bad as the Spanish, who were the worst, because they started slavery into North America, into the colonies. But he's cautious in that he's trying to convince the British people to support the anti-slavery movement. So he refers to them repeatedly as the noble British, noble Britons. The king is this wonderful person of that we can reside our hopes and trust in. So while he's saying these horrible things are going to happen to you, like some horrible things have already happened to you, even worse will happen to you if you don't straighten up. But you are the guys who we have the greatest chance for because you have the most potential. So in that sense, yes, cautious, careful rhetorician.
The history of African philosophy is very varied, and I mean, it's not a monolithic block. It's not just one single philosophy. It's many traditions, many also very indigenous traditions often. A lot of ancient philosophy happened in Africa. For example, ancient texts in Egypt, or like the intellectual movement in Timbuktu, when it was a real trade center and intellectual center of that part of the world. More recently, more modern African philosophy mainly traces back to the history of colonialism and oppression and slavery.
We know about the missionaries and Christianity being taken into Africa, into India and so on, but it didn't come with freedom. It came with control. So I don't understand that. If you're going to preach religion, then surely you would preach it with freedom and not enslavement.
I mean, even like the biblical justifications were incredibly tenuous. Like there's nothing in the Old Testament that says that Ham was actually dark-skinned or black. That is something that was kind of put in much, much later. So you have people scrambling here looking at the Old Testament, even though the New Testament of the Bible talks about Christianly far more kind of universalist, humanistic kind of behavior. People pick and chose really the bits of the Old Testament that they wanted to use to justify. And that's both Catholics and kind of Protestants, as I've said already.
Repeatedly goes back to the Bible as a basis for attacking slavery. It's a complicated problem for anyone in the 18th century because slavery is not condemned outright in the Bible. Certainly not in the Old Testament, and not even in the New Testament. The New Testament, there's never a statement that slavery is absolutely evil, because slavery was a recognized status in the times of the New Testament. The argument was that you should treat all people as, all fellow Christians particularly, as equals. And of course, spiritually, we're all equal. He also argues, given the fact that literally you can't say the Bible condemns all forms of slavery.
Obviously, these slave masters, they owned you, didn't they? And to think you can own another human being, as you said, if you're a Christian, why would you own another human being, telling them what to do, when they do, and work them to the ground? You know, I think that was a really good point that he made.
I also think the emphasis on that equality is universal. It matters for Western people, white people, but for people of color as well. I think we take that intellectually for granted, but especially in public life, it's not taken for granted. Migrants are still treated as second-rate citizens. People of color are, in some European countries, still second-rate citizens, which is, of course, not right, not just, not moral.
But it's when people don't want to have a healthy conversation. And part of the problem we have in the British society is so much of what we do is adversarial. So PMQs in Parliament, rather than Labour or Conservative having a conversation, it's who can score points, land the knockout punch. And it's the same with the law. Prosecution and defence, they're always trying to outmaneuver each other, rather than let's have a conversation to see how close we can get to an agreement and to what we consider to be the truth.
Christianity in the hands of the self-serving was used to justify the enslavement of millions, but in the hands of the courageous became a force to protect humanity and expose the evils of slavery. Ottobah dismantled religious zealotry from within the faith itself, demonstrating what a true Christian looks like. Someone whose words are backed by action. In the final part of this series, we will explore the slavery economy that propelled Western dominance in the modern world and the ethical systems that surrounded and sustained it.
Soul survivor, taken from Africa with the art of a lion, fierce as a tiger. Soul survivor, taken from Africa with the art of a lion, fierce as a tiger, burning and burning.